Hi, I'm Rich Johannesson.
And I'm Matt Sabatello.
And this is the second episode of the Tick Bootcamp podcast. We are titling today's podcast, Who Are You? One of the things that we talked about in our last podcast was that we have encoded into our DNA, and we have encoded into our culture, and we have coded into our social mores the tools that we need to protect ourselves from tick diseases. And one of the comparisons that we want to begin to develop and talk about is the way that we treat people who have STDs. One of the things that we're very careful about doing is determining whether or not a potential sex partner has a sexually transmitted disease. And if we do determine that a sex partner has a sexually transmitted disease, we either avoid them or we take proper hygienic precautions to make sure that that disease is not transferred to us. Likewise, a tick disease, such as Lyme disease, is a disease of exposure. And if you don't have exposure to a tick, or if you do have exposure to a tick and you take proper precautions to make sure that tick does not cause you to suffer a tick disease, then you will not get Lyme disease. So encoded in our culture, encoded in our society, and more importantly, encoded into our DNA is the tools that we need to be free and clear of illnesses related to ticks and tick diseases. So the purpose of our journey together here is to begin to have this conversation, to ask folks to participate in a conversation about which tools we are already using in our daily lives that will protect us from tick diseases. So, Matt, in discussing Lyme and discussing tick diseases and in doing our research, there have been some pretty good podcasts out there. Would you agree?
Right. I would agree. So there's some very good podcasts out there that discuss Lyme disease and how to treat it, how to manage it, and how to live with Lyme disease.
And have you found those podcasts to be helpful to you in your Lyme journey?
I have, and those podcasts are very helpful. However, that's not going to be our podcast, Rich. Our podcast is going to focus on three key areas of people, and we're going to focus on number one. If you want to join a conversation with us to discuss the tools you need to protect yourself from ticks, the diseases they carry, the bacteria they carry, and some people that may fit into that category is if you're a mom, if you're a hiker, if you're a hunter, an athlete, if you're a member of the active military. This podcast is for you if you want to identify tools and techniques to prevent yourself from coming into contact with ticks.
The other group of people that we're making this podcast for are people who have been victimized by Lyme disease, and they are interested in entering into a conversation that's different than the conversation that's currently taking place in those other very important and very well done podcasts on Lyme disease. What I mean by that, Matt, is there are many people who are suffering from Lyme disease and want to make sure that they're not going to live with other family members who have Lyme disease, that they understand how they contracted their Lyme disease, because 50% of the people who are diagnosed with Lyme disease today never knew that they were bitten by a tick. They never came across the tick. They just developed symptoms which ultimately resulted in them being diagnosed with Lyme disease. And my sense is that, and I admit on some level of speculation, that the number of people who are diagnosed with Lyme disease and did not have contact with a tick or didn't realize they were bitten by a tick is a very small subset of the people who actually have Lyme disease and who are not diagnosed.
Right.
So I think the number of people who recall a tick bite or recall having contact with a tick is a very small subset of all of the people who have Lyme disease. So it's really important for folks who have Lyme disease to understand what that process was that they went through and to pass that information on to their family members, because we know that Lyme disease is a family disease. There are many examples of folks who have demonstrated that really well. My favorite book of all the books that I've read on Lyme disease is Pamela Weintraub's book entitled Cure Unknown. And in Pamela's book, she tells this heart-wrenching story of how her entire family contracted Lyme disease and how it destroyed her children's childhood. It's a powerful, powerful book. It is heart-wrenching, and it does demonstrate in very powerful ways how tick diseases are family diseases. And there are many other examples of that. We don't have to look any further than the housewife influencer, Yolanda Hadid. who herself has written on Lyme disease, and she has 2 children with Lyme disease. And then a third example that we can give, Matt, is there was that young 5-month-old child who from Connecticut who contracted Powassan disease, or Powassan, I think is how you pronounce that disease. And that poor child, who did not die, thank God, but has suffered neurological symptoms, contracted that disease from his father's hunting clothes. His father went hunting and he came home and bitten by a tick from his father's clothing. So that's the second group of people that we are making this podcast for, those people who have Lyme disease and want to learn about the process so that they can protect their families from Lyme disease.
The third group of people that we want to focus on for our podcast are going to be people that suffer with chronic illnesses. So if you have a chronic health condition, we want you to listen to our journey. As you hear the symptoms and the things that can occur with Lyme disease, and you hear about the things that you can do to prevent Lyme disease, this may bring you back to the beginning of your journey with your chronic health condition and say, wow, a lot of those things are consistent with my story, and maybe I should get a test, and maybe my test wasn't accurate if I already had a Lyme test, and maybe I should use a company like IGeneX to get the proper testing to get a diagnosis and start my journey of healing from Lyme disease or another tick-borne disease. So research has demonstrated that as people become aware of these symptoms and these things that can cause these chronic diseases, they're more likely to then identify themselves as having this disease and starting their journey of healing and health.
So Matt, let's talk about who we're not doing this podcast for. The first group of people we're not doing this podcast for are climate change deniers. If you do not believe that we are currently in a period of climate change, and that climate change has not been caused by man or by humans, then this podcast is not for you. Because we know that climate change is occurring. We know that question really should be beyond debate, yes. And we also know that the consequences of that climate change are that the environment is now much more hospitable to ticks. Ticks have longer breeding periods. They have longer periods of time when they can get the blood meal that they need to survive, and a substantially larger percentage of ticks are living. As a consequence of a substantially larger number of ticks living due to climate change, correct, we know that there is more tick exposure, and as we had discussed earlier on, Matt, Lyme disease is a disease of exposure.
That's right, Rich. And as time goes on, this problem is going to get worse. The other group of people that our podcast is not for are the soldiers in the Lyme War. We know that there is chronic Lyme disease. So those people who say there is absolutely no chronic Lyme disease is a curable disease, don't tune in, and this podcast is not for you, because I know from my experience chronic Lyme disease is real. I lived through it, and that is a fact in our eyes, and I think that is a fact in becoming more and more of a fact throughout the entire medical community. So if you're a soldier in the Lyme War and you feel there's no chronic Lyme disease, this podcast is not for you.
And the last group of people who this podcast is not for are science geeks. We're trying to give actionable information to ordinary people who want to protect themselves and their families without having to have a degree in biology or zoology or some other ology. And what we want to do is we want to use everyday terms to describe the tools that you need to defend yourself. We will not use terms like vectors. We will not use terms like zoonosis. We aren't planning to use egg, larva, nymph, or adult description, and we're certainly not intending to use the term Haller's organ. This is not a science course. This is not a science podcast. This is a podcast designed to give actionable and practical information to people who are looking to protect themselves from Lyme disease, from people who are looking to learn more about themselves and the genetically and DNA encoded tools available to them to protect themselves and their families from Lyme disease. So in sum, Matt, what we're doing is we're going to be discussing 3 types of tick exposure protections, and that's who we're designing this podcast for. We want to enter into a discussion about avoidance and avoidance techniques. We want to enter into a discussion about detection and detection techniques, and we want to enter into a discussion about early intervention and those techniques.
That's right, Rich, and we encourage our listeners to tune in to our next podcast titled Tick Picks. I had taken a picture of a tick, sent it away for analysis, and we will discuss the outcome and the results at our next podcast. So
And actually, Matt, that was my tick. The tick that had bitten me is the tick that you were taking a picture of, correct?
that's right. So it's going to be a really good one. We encourage you to tune in. Thank you for listening to our tickbootcamp.com podcast, and tune in next week.